Just in time for Valentine's Day. Hashtag lawyer today, we're going to talk about premarital agreements, or as everybody calls them, prenups. We're going to demystify a lot of the misconceptions about them and tell you why they actually are a pretty good idea. Welcome back to Hashtag Lawyer, everybody.
Hey.
We got Andrea and myself here today, and it's timely, maybe untimely, I don't know. We're talking about premarital agreements on the eve of Valentine's Day.
On the eve of Valentine's Day. Well, I think it's great. You know, a lot of people like to propose on Valentine's Day because they think it's the most romantic day of the year. To each their own. I liked my proposal, but, definitely was not Valentine's Day.
And you know what? Yeah, we can be biased about that. I liked your proposal, too. I got to be there for the aftermath.
Yeah, you did. You helped clean up the setup. Thank you for that.
Did. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that this can be a polarizing topic.
Very polarizing. I definitely have family members who are like, prenups, if you get a prenup, it's basically setting yourself up for divorce. And I was like,
right.
I have a different opinion, but I respect your opinion.
Yeah, well, and I told you before you came on the show, my mom and I have had the same conversation. I think she's worried that because I want a prenup that I'm never going to get married, but I think I finally convinced her that's not necessarily the case. So we'll see, I guess. Yeah,
well, we'll get into it, and I'll definitely give my thoughts on prenups. I mean, frankly, like if someone asked me, should I get a prenup? I'm like, are you a professional, a doctor, a lawyer? You should get a prenup. Just saying, and we'll get into why, because I think it's also, frankly, to protect the other person almost more than yourself.
Absolutely.
I think they're loving.
No, I think so too. I think so too, and I agree with everything you said. And we're going to touch on every single one of those specific issues as we dive through this. But let's start with one thing. Let's get the terminology down.
Yes, I love terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to use the term prenup because that's society-wise, that's what everybody's used to them being called. In Texas, they're legally not called prenups. They're called premarital agreements or postmarital agreements. But, we're going to use the term prenup because Kanye said it. It's easier to use that term. Let's just do that, right?
Yeah, and that's interesting. I think they probably might have some sort of prenup involved with Kim Kardashian West and Kanye West, since she's apparently allegedly lawyered up for a divorce with Hollywood's number one divorce attorney. So I would be very surprised if those two didn't have a prenup.
If they didn't have a prenup,
I know, and California is a community property state, so I think, I don't know, maybe we poll our listeners on Instagram later, but I would be interested, if no one else, in what the West divorce, alleged maybe happening West divorce, would look like if there's a prenup, if there's not a prenup, what's going to happen with the kids given, Kanye's mental health concerns, which no stigma, it's illness is illness. But how does that play into when someone has an illness that's not their fault? How does that play into it? So I would be very curious to see how that turns out.
I think I'd be more interested in what the over and under would be on the total cost of the divorce and legal fees. But I don't know.
Of course, you're worried about the money. I'm worried about the kids and the horses at the ranch.
I want to see if Vegas is going to put a line out there on that. I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
Could be worth some money there, but regardless. I do think you talked about California being a community property state, and that actually segues us right into what the purpose of a prenup is.
You're welcome.
And good. So obviously Texas is a community property state as well. And Andrea, for briefly, we don't have to go through the whole doctrine of this, but there's a difference between community property and separate property. And you kind of just on the surface level, what does that mean to our listeners?
Absolutely. So we like to share between married couples in Texas, apparently. So basically, when you get married, there is a presumption in Texas that any property acquired, whether it's real estate or actual personal property like a dog or or money that you've earned, right? So your income, that's all going to be termed community property. So that's the community, the property of the marriage, right? So it all belongs to the marriage, and the individuals in the marriage have a right to one half of the community property, is kind of the base presumption that if the marriage dissolves, you start with you're entitled to 1/2 of the community property. Generally, obviously that is dependent on the scenarios. Now, separate property means that it is not part of the community. The marriage doesn't have that property in its bucket, if you will. And separate property is going to be generally what the spouse owned prior to marriage or is given by gift, devise, or descent during the marriage. But with the funny part there is that you would have to trace, basically prove up the origin or the provenance of the item. So for example, if I have a Picasso and my great granny Harriet died, bless her heart, God bless, rest her soul, and she left the Picasso to me in her will, I am married, the presumption in Texas would be that that Picasso is community property. But in actuality, if I can trace it and show that it was given to me via a will, then that is now considered my separate property. So Spencer does not have a 1/2 interest in it. It's all mine.
Right. Well, yeah. and that's a great synopsis of it. And you mentioned the buckets a second ago. I always like to kind of use that as an illustration, is that in a situation like this, you've got 3 buckets. You've got the community bucket in the center, and then each partner has their separate bucket. And then things go into the community bucket, and everybody gets half of that generically, like you said, in Texas. And so the purpose of a prenup, on the whole, is that it prevents assets that normally could be considered community, that would go in that community bucket. It keeps them from being classified that way, and it has them maintain separate property characteristic. And so the idea being that you end up not having some of these assets go in this community bucket.
Or any
assets. That's part of it too, and we'll get into some of that. But it's the idea is that it simplifies and says, if we get divorced, if one of us dies, boom, this is how it's going to be. There's not going to be, theoretically, there's not going to be a fight over how these assets are divided up. And you and I always talk about prenups in a positive light, because there are definite benefits to having them. Obviously,
of course,
one is the protection of assets in the event of a divorce. But one of some of the situations you talk about all the time are protection of creditors. I mean, kind of walk us through that.
Absolutely. So I think a really critical portion of a prenup is that it protects assets from creditors. Specifically, let's give an example, right? So Spencer and I are both lawyers, and I'm going to give 2 versions of this example. One depends on us being lawyers, one does not. If I'm driving and all of a sudden I, God forbid, hit Johnny the kid, who runs out chasing a soccer ball into the street, and he's severely injured, I get sued, and the jury's like, oh, $5 million. Well, I don't have $5 million. So they would then say, oh, you're married, right? So all of your income that you have earned since marriage and any property that you've obtained since marriage, right? That's community property. So we can go ahead and take half of that to fulfill the judgment against Johnny the kid. Okay, well, some of the stuff that we bought since marriage, that's also Spencer's. That's not fair in my mind for my fault in this hypothetical situation. I messed up, and then he's being punished by losing half of his income that he's saved up, because his income and my income would be considered community property, and I'm basically entitled to have his income. So they would go and they would take half of his income from him, and I don't think that's fair, and I want to protect him from that. So that's where prenup would come in.
Right. Yeah, and you take it a step further. Let's say you had to file bankruptcy. That's having that premarital agreement there, that prenup, would help, again, still protect his assets, because that's a lot of things that people don't realize. If in that hypothetical, Andrea, you file bankruptcy, well, your community assets that are there, that's open season for the bankruptcy trustee to snatch up, sell off, to try to satisfy your creditors, and they could be taking something out of Spencer's pocket too. So you're absolutely right.
Absolutely. And then the third thing too is that because Spencer and I are both lawyers, right, we can be sued for essentially professional negligence, right, or malpractice, as it's most likely called. And so, God forbid that ever happens, but if you have a disgruntled client, say, who comes in and they say, oh, Andrea, you're a lawyer, I'm going to sue you for malpractice. Well, God forbid that happened. If there was a judgment, again, Spencer's half of the community property would also be up for grabs for that creditor to take. And I don't want that for him. That's not fair to him. Yeah, so absolutely. A prenup would protect against that.
And I think I know that's the side of prenups that most people don't recognize, appreciate, understand, is that it really does provide a lot of protection for both parties in those types of scenarios. So, okay, we're talking about the benefits of the prenup. What are some disadvantages to a prenup? And I'm going to take this one and just say there's really aren't any. I mean, the hardest part is probably having a difficult conversation that can be difficult, doesn't have to be, with your partner, and trying to have that conversation to discuss that you do want a prenup and that you think it's best for the two of you. I mean, what do you think, Andrea?
I definitely think one of the biggest disadvantages to having a prenup is there's a lot of taboo around prenups, and I think a lot of times younger couples, maybe you have a young doctor, a couple getting married, or a doctor and a lawyer, they view a prenup as kind of what I gave with the hypothetical about Spencer and me and the hypothetical malpractice suit. They want to try and protect each other from, med mal claims or professional negligence claims, right? But maybe their families are very traditional and they're very conservative, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. If that works for you, you do you. But they might see that and say, John and Kathy, why are you getting a prenup? You're setting yourselves up for divorce. Marriage should be a team. You are a team building exercise. What's yours is mine. What's mine is yours. And by getting a prenup, you're setting a bad, leaky foundation for your marriage, and you're upping your chances of getting divorced. And there's just a lot of, I think, shame that's brought on by some families. And, I'm not saying that they're doing it out of mean-spiritedness. I think a lot of times that's probably out of just concern because they want the best for their child and future child-in-law.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you.
But it's difficult.
It is, and I think it can be in that sense. And I think it also I've seen it in my own practice of having to talk to clients about how do you approach your significant other about this conversation if you haven't done it. So let's talk through the steps to actually putting a prenup together. We've talked about the concepts, and let's go through kind of the process. So
absolutely,
one of the things is that a prenup doesn't necessarily have to be a complicated document. I mean, in Texas, there's only two requirements. It's got to be an agreement that's in writing and that is signed by both parties. At that point, you have a valid prenup, and there's ways to challenge it, and we'll get into that in a second. But let's kind of talk through the steps to having it, and to putting it together. One, we just touched on, you've got to have that conversation between the two partners, and that can be difficult. And in my opinion, I want to hear what you think about this, Andrea. I think this isn't legal advice. This is just life advice. I think that's something that probably should happen early on in the dating relationship, because it's a little easier to kind of have that combo whenever you don't have a pending engagement. What do you think?
I 100% agree. And from a relationship standpoint, here's my thing. I also think it's really important to develop a level of comfort and ease talking with your potential spouse about financial matters very early on. Because if you can't talk about financial matters and other critical issues like children, religion, and, to an extent, political beliefs, if you can't talk about those critical things after sufficient time, right? You think this might be your forever person. At that point, if you can't have that conversation, then there's probably something wrong and you might need to reevaluate. So I think actually having the conversation about finances and prenup early on, and early being like, oh, I think this person might be the one for me, and then shortly thereafter having that conversation about a prenup, I think is critical to act as a barometer of whether you should proceed down the marriage route or whether you should be like, hey, I'm seeing red flags now.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the timing, there's no black and white answer on that, obviously. I mean, I learned from experience that having the fact that I want a prenup on my Hinge and Bumble profile was maybe a little too early.
I think that's probably a little too early, Austin.
But you got to figure out at one point, do you have that conversation down the road?
Sure.
But yeah, it's trial and error, right? You got to try different things, see what works. What I will say is that having that conversation, 4 to 6 weeks before you get married is a huge problem from a relationship standpoint, but then also from the law firm you're going to hire to do your prenup. You create some timing issues there that we get into here in a little bit. But I think on top of the timing, I think the delivery of the message is the important part. That's how you have that conversation. talking about some of the things that you were just discussing, Andrea, about how it protects everything is something I think you've got to put into motion as well. And so let's say you've had the conversation, you guys are both on board. You could probably draft your own prenup, right? You don't need a lawyer.
You're so funny. No.
And
definitely not.
All the time. We pitch this all the time. And I think one of the key components here, obviously, you and I are all huge proponents of hire a lawyer, save you money, save you stress, worth the investment. We're biased, but we're not wrong either. But what would you say to someone who says, well, okay, I can just hire any lawyer that can draft this prenup. That's not a big deal. They don't have to have specific experience, right?
That's a bad move, to hire any lawyer to draft your prenup. I'm not going to hire a tax lawyer to write a prenup. They probably don't even know what a prenup is half the time because their head is so full. They're brilliant people, brilliant lawyers, but their head is so full stuffed of tax issues, they probably don't know the first thing about writing a prenup. And there are certain things that have to go into a prenup, right? You have to have a good understanding of community versus separate property. You have to have an understanding of basic family law and property characterization. And if you don't have a good understanding about that, how are you going to write a good prenup? And how are you going to write a prenup that achieves the goal of protecting your future spouse's assets from creditors when they're coming after spouse one? You know, spouse two shouldn't basically be in risk of losing half of his or her stuff because of spouse one's mistake. So you want someone who knows how to draft language to ensure that doesn't happen. And secondly, frankly, a prenup is more, you can bust a prenup, but it's harder to bust a prenup if it's written by a qualified lawyer who has done prenups before on both sides. You want both sides to be represented by quality lawyers who have experience drafting prenups and can identify any potential issues there. And then at that point, frankly, it's hard to bust the prenup, which protects your future spouse from creditors because creditors will try to bust that prenup to try and get more money. And so that's another reason why I think it's important to have qualified lawyers doing it, because you don't want your prenup busted by creditors or a bankruptcy court.
Yeah, or candidly, your potential ex-spouse. That's
that too. But you know.
Well,
I'm optimistic.
No, absolutely. And the only reason I say that is that I've definitely had experience of drafting and then having to litigate the prenup that I drafted. I've had experience having to deal with and defend someone trying to bust a prenup that someone else has drafted. It's hard to do, but people will fight tooth and nail when there is a lot of money on the table. And so it's one of those deals that you've got to have someone who knows what they're doing and knows how that system works on the front and the back end, like you said, Andrea. And so hiring an experienced lawyer that has worked in the field is extremely important. And so let's say, all right, we've had the conversation, we're on the same page. I've contacted a lawyer. I know who I'm going to use to draft my prenup. Next stage is both sides have to formally disclose the assets that they own. And the purpose of this is to make sure that no one is pulling the wool over anybody's eyes or hiding anything to where you're signing something that you don't fully appreciate, right? Yeah. So
absolutely. Because look, at the end of the day, that's pretty important. If you have, a $5 million house in Miami Beach, that's something your spouse should probably know about.
Yeah.
That's important. Or if you have massive student loans, that actually is a legit concern for a lot of young professionals, is they might have a lot of student loans. And that's something that needs to be disclosed to their future spouse, because that's not fair for their future spouse to be blindsided, being like, wait, what, you owe like $1 gazillion in student loans? I had no idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you disclose your assets, and then now we get to the actual meat of the agreement itself, right? So you start drafting, the lawyer starts putting together everything. And you mentioned this earlier, you alluded to it, but it's recommended, although not required, that we have counsel, we have lawyers on both sides, both the drafting side and the reviewing side. And so, when you have a lawyer in a prenup situation, they represent one party, husband, wife, they represent one of them. And so what we're saying is that you should probably have a lawyer on the other side for the reviewing part of it to represent the other party. Why do you think that's important, Andrea?
I think that's critically important, because if you don't have a lawyer on the other side and the person just represents, I'm going to say herself, because that's oftentimes what it is, at that point, it's easier to go in and bust the prenup because that woman didn't have an understanding of the legal ramifications of the document she was signing, is the argument that could possibly be made.
Right. And then that is one of the grounds for potentially busting up a prenup. And so then having the lawyers on both sides, it allows negotiation to occur. And the cool thing about prenups, one of the great things about them is that they're very customizable. You can make it to where there is zero community estate established, and everybody keeps their separate property. Everything that they earn during the marriage is separate. All of their efforts and economic improvement maintains their separate property. And then you can also carve out specific assets that you say, well, you know what, there's not going to be community property except our home. Our home is going to go into the community bucket. And we want that to be something that if we get divorced, if we have problems later on down the road with creditors, whatever, we know this is going to be community and we both share equally in the equity of that home. And so it's very customizable when it comes to that. I've seen premarital agreements that also carve out specific clauses about alimony that say, okay, if we get divorced, partner one will pay X amount of alimony for X amount of months, and we're just going to agree that that's what we're going to do.
And quick, alimony is spousal maintenance, right?
It is, yeah. And alimony is another one of those slang terms that.
Yeah, it's a slang term because technically Texas doesn't have alimony per se.
Correct. In Texas, we call it spousal maintenance, and there's a whole slew of requirements and all those types of things.
Yeah.
Now, with children, this is an interesting point that sometimes gets glossed over. You cannot agree to a certain amount of child support in a premarital agreement. But however, you can agree to certain decisions as it pertains to the child, like decision-making ability and things of that nature. I found that to be pretty interesting that the courts, when they say, okay, we're always going to judge what's in the best interest of the child when we're making decisions in court about family law cases, yet we're still going to allow premarital agreements to have some say in certain decision parts or decisions that can be made about the child. I found that interesting, and it kind of bothered me a little bit. I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that?
It seems a little incongruent to me, right? Because at the end of the day, the one rule, like you're fond of saying, family court is the wild, wild west. And the one rule that governs above all in family law is best interest of child. I mean, I can repeat that in my sleep now. And so that seems kind of strange to me that the court would still take into consideration what was put forth in a prenup, especially if it's a very traditional scenario where the couple hasn't had any children yet and they don't have a child until after they're married. I think that's strange because, you can't always predict what is in the best interest of the child before the child is even born. I think it's strange. I also understand that in Texas, we're a state that loves freedom of contract. You can contract for just about anything so long as it's not contracted for under duress and it's legal. So it seems to me that maybe the family law courts are trying to balance those two competing interests, best interest of child, but also freedom to contract in Texas.
Sure. So. That makes sense, but I do think it's a weird choice to make. It's okay.
It's strange.
You can't do this. You can't do that. Yeah. It almost to me would seem that you would take the decision-making power away and say, okay, yeah, you can agree on child support because that's dollars and cents, but.
Yeah, who knows? But anyway, one thing that is very important and everyone that is getting a prenup should absolutely do is delineate the pets. Who is taking care of the pets? Who do the pets belong to? God forbid you get a divorce. Who do the pets go to? Your pets should not have to suffer and be collateral damage in a divorce. Like they should not, if it is mom's dog and that dog loves mama, do not take away that dog from mama. That is just cruel and unusual in my personal opinion. And not, whatever amendment says, 8th Amendment, right? And so guys, make sure you know what you're doing when it comes to pets. Okay? Just make sure, if you have a puppy before you got married, I mean that because you bought the puppy before it was married, it's your separate property, but it's just put it in there. Just put in there that, you have the puppy and that way there's absolutely no issues later on after you're married of, oh, did you buy that puppy like 2 weeks before we were married or 2 weeks after we were married? Hold on, let me dig up the receipt. Because who keeps that receipt? Like, just do your pets a favor.
And listeners, welcome to the part of the show where Andrea got the most passionate when talking about prenups, which we all knew was going to happen, talking about pets.
The pets.
That actually, pets can be a hugely contested issue in a divorce. And so if you can figure out, and it does take a little bit of forward thinking, right? Because if you're going to say, all right, we think we're going to end up having 2 dogs. And so let's discuss who gets the dogs, hypothetical dogs that we don't have yet, who gets to take them if and when we get divorced. I mean, and it can be drafted that way, and we're going to get into some of that in a second, but I agree. That's something you should think about, because that could be the one thing you end up fighting about and spending a lot of money on if you don't deal with it at the prenup stage. So
absolutely.
So let's say you get all these clauses put in. You've got clauses about the pets. You've got clauses about how you're going to divide up your specific assets. You've got any child care decisions may put in there. Everything's ready. Everybody's ready to go. And then at that point, everybody signs. You sign, you agree to everything, you sign off on it. That's not filed anywhere. That's something that just the parties keep themselves. It's not put into the court system or anything like that. And then after that, you are required to have a formal marriage. So we've talked about common law marriage before on this show. You have to actually have a little bit. We've touched on it in terms of in some of the estate planning.
Oh, okay, yes, I think we did.
Very, very briefly, yeah. But in this situation, you have to have a formal marriage, which means, and I'm going to give my little side experience here, because as Andrea knows, I actually am ordained and licensed to officiate weddings.
You scared me. I was like, Austin, is this where you tell me you've been secretly married whole time? Shoot, I can't set you up with any of my girlfriends now.
Spoiler alert for everybody.
Yeah.
No.
Sorry, guys.
It's the irony, as my mom likes to say, I can marry people and divorce them because of my specific licenses. I never done that. I like
your mom. She's pretty cool.
Yeah, never done that, by the way. But in Texas, it is interesting to officiate or to be formally wed. You have to get a marriage license, which everybody's heard about that. Going down to the county clerk's office, you gotta have that 72-hour waiting period, all that kind of stuff. And then second, you just have to be wed by someone who is licensed to perform weddings. And so you got to knock those 2 things out. You got to get those done. And once you do that, okay, you're formally married. The next step for a prenup, although not required, I highly, highly recommend it, because it helps just to really kind of put a bow on the whole thing, is to have the parties come in and sign what's called a ratification of the prenup that was signed before the marriage. Get married, have them sign a ratification and say, yep, remember signing that, still agree with it, we're all good, we've been married now, everything's good to go. And that just kind of ties everything together, because it kind of helps tackle some of these issues that we're going to talk about now, which are the limits to a prenup. And Andrea, there's really only 2 categories of ways to, as you said, bust a prenup, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and those 2 methods to bust that prenup, I'm sure there's a rap song about that somewhere, is unconscionability and if the prenup was secured under duress. So, unconscionability. Basically, unconscionability, paraphrasing massively here, is if one partner hides their assets or essentially commits some sort of fraud as to the value of their estate or all of their assets against their partner. So, for example, John and Kathleen are getting married. They have a prenup. John secretly has a $10 million mansion in Malibu Hills, and he doesn't disclose that to Kathy. And that would be a problem if he ever went into bankruptcy and whatever. I don't know. They had problems with the $10 million Malibu mansion later on. So that would be, I think, an example of unconscionability. What would you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the reason we have the disclosures, right? Because you need everybody to disclose everything. And if you don't do that, you're not necessarily sealing your fate, but you're putting ammunition into the possibility that you could have this prenup busted because it's unconscionable. It's not fair, right? And then I think the duress side is a little bit easier to fully understand, because the idea is, okay, one side signs the prenup involuntarily. A couple of those things, we've already touched on it throughout this episode. They weren't represented by counsel. And like you were talking about earlier, Andrea, that maybe they didn't fully understand what they were signing, and that's not a black and white thing. It just is a factor that could tend to show that they signed it under duress. But I think my favorite one that is far more common is that the premarital agreement is signed far too close to the actual wedding date.
You know what my favorite prenup case that I read, because I was a few years ago asked to see if I could bust a prenup.
Okay.
And I think my favorite case that I read about was the prenup was signed on the eve of the wedding, and the fiance was about to pop. I mean, she's like 9 million months pregnant, and she literally, I mean, she's like could give birth walking down the aisle. Who knows, right? And so the fiance, I guess, is for both parties. Anyway, so he popped the prenup on her like within 48 hours of the wedding or whatever, and he was like, oh, by the way, if you don't sign this, we're not getting married. And she's like literally about to have his baby. She's like, okay. So she signed it, and I can't quite remember the outcome of that case, but I'm guessing it probably was closer to duress than the husband would have liked.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, Andrea. So let's go back to your wedding date. Right before the wedding, I mean, how stressful were things about trying to make sure everything was where it needed to be, all the decorations are done correctly? I mean, everything is in place. I mean, how stressed out were you?
Oh, I was so stressed. I was so stressed that I actually had like probably one of the worst sinus infections of my life on my wedding day. Thank God my best friend's dad is a doctor, and he's like treated me in the past, so he was able to like give me a checkup and like, you know, prescribe the appropriate medication for me, so I wasn't completely like miserable on my wedding day. But like it was very stressful. The floral arch, right? It literally, so we had an outdoor ceremony. It was really windy earlier in the day. My florist had done this beautiful job of setting up this arch, and it was it was gorgeous. Park City's Petals, shout out. You guys are amazing. I love them. Use them for everything. Love them. Anyway, it was really windy, and it was completely unexpected. The arch, which we had rented, was knocked over. And so thank God no one told me, because I would have lost my mind. I would have been out there in my little like, you know, bride's robe trying to like freaking tie it down and this and that. But, you know, they were able to fix it and they tied it down, but it had landed right where all of the immediate family and the grandparents would have been sitting. So that would have been a huge disaster if that had happened during the ceremony when they were sitting, because they would have been injured. So that's just one thing I was worried about. So that was the problem. And then there were, you know, like, I was lucky. My ring bearer and flower girls were super sweet and well-behaved little kiddos, and their parents are angels, and so there were no problems there. But I can imagine not everyone is as lucky. And what if you're trying to wrangle the flower girls, you know, earlier in the day, and you're like, oh my gosh, one of them's missing, or oh no, they're like jumping on the bed, and one of them might break their arm and then can't walk, and there's so many different things. And also, there were so many different things that I almost walked down the aisle without my veil. And I was obsessed with this veil. It's like cathedral length plus 2 feet veil and barge. Loved it. Was obsessed. That was one of my favorite pieces of my wedding outfit. And I was so stressed, I almost forgot it. Thank God for one of my bridesmaids, Tara, Avance, shout out. She was like, Andrea, where's your veil? And I was like, I don't have my veil on. Oh my gosh. She's like, don't worry, I got it. And she's cool as a cucumber, sprints up the stairs in her heels, like angel, grabs it, brings it down. She's like, here you go, and like helps place it, and it's perfect. And I was like almost crying because I was so relieved.
So see, I think that like the fact that we just went on like a 17-minute tangent about how stressful your wedding was illustrates my point that if you give somebody a premarital agreement, a prenup on the eve of their wedding, they're not in their right mind to sit there and analyze this and think about it.
I will say, I loved my wedding, wouldn't change a thing. I think I had like the perfect wedding, and if I had the perfect wedding and it was still very stressful, I can only imagine for other people who don't have the perfect wedding and kind bridesmaids and a great wedding planner and supportive mother and mother-in-law who are doing everything they can to help, how much even more stressful it would be, you know?
Right.
So that's, yeah.
And that's how we get to duress, right? You plop this prenup down in front of someone who's dealing with 67 different things that potentially could go wrong at their wedding, and have them sign that. Okay, well, there's a pretty good argument there that this might have been secured under duress. And so those are potential ways that you could potentially bust a prenup. And I think as we kind of move towards the last section of this show, this is the biggest part. If our listeners don't take anything away from this episode, I think 2 things. 1, prenups are a very valuable thing. They provide a lot of protection. And 2, I think it's astounding how many people say, well, look, we don't really have anything right now. We're not really wealthy. We're not rich. So we don't need a prenup, right? I mean, that's not what this is about. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Right, Andrea?
No, it makes no sense whatsoever, because personally, I think the biggest value from a prenup doesn't come from saying, oh, I don't have anything, so if I get divorced, it doesn't matter because I don't own anything. No, I think the biggest protection in a prenup is protection against creditors, so that your spouse, their hard-earned income and property isn't taken away unfairly by a creditor. And so I think it's actually very loving, because you're putting them first and their financial security first, and taking steps to ensure that things are not wrongfully taken away from them.
Yeah, well, and exactly, and those are things that are obtained through the marriage, during the marriage, while you're together. And so when people say, well, we don't have anything, well, guys, we talked about this earlier. Whatever you have at that point before you're married, a separate property anyways.
Yeah.
So under the law, it's probably going to be protected under the family code. That's already there.
Mm-hmm.
You're not putting a prenup together for the protection of those assets specifically. You can't address those. The idea is where you go after the marriage. What happens after marriage? What assets and empire do you build after the marriage? That's what you're protecting. And that's what I think so many people miss, is they think, well, we got to have a lot of money to justify a prenup. Well, no, what if you don't have any money, but then guess what? You guys, one person in the marriage built an empire. Well, the 50% of that is the other person's if you don't have a prenup, and it's subject to potential creditor attack. It's subject to taken during divorce. And so those are the things that I think people are a little short-sighted on when they just make a judgment about, well, we don't have assets, we don't need a prenup. Well, if you plan on being successful, plan on making money, you should put one together.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important. Look, for example, you've got John and Kathy, right? They're both broke students. John's a lawyer, Kathy's a doctor, aspiring pediatrician. Her goal in life is to build a great pediatric practice where she can specialize in helping children who I have cleft palate. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
So, okay, so that's her whole practice, is basically fixing cleft palate for young children. And say she does a great job, it's a huge success, and then God forbid something bad happens, someone sues her, they didn't have a prenup, and basically they can go in and say someone sues her husband for malpractice, allegedly. Well, if they didn't have a prenup, if she built that pediatric practice after the marriage, he can go in and basically, half of it is up for grabs for his creditors, essentially. Now, I'm massively paraphrasing. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of actual details that would go into this. But anyway, she poured her life into this practice to helping kids, and now the funding for it can be taken away, or at least half of it can be. And now she's going to have a hard time continuing to help kids through her practice. And that's just not fair to her or those kids that she's helping.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go, Andrea, you've done a phenomenal job staying on the positive side of this thing. I am going to have to throw in a little bit of a divorce hypothetical here, just a little more negative. But again, I think it's really important for illustrative purposes. Two things that people need to think about here. One is, in Texas, if one party to the marriage wants to get a divorce, there's nothing the other party can do to stop that person from filing for divorce and getting that divorce. Just, they can't stop that train once it starts going down the tracks unless they convince the other person to stop. So that's one piece of it. The other piece that I think a lot of people don't think about is retirement plans. So I'll tell you a hypothetical case where you've got a person who was the breadwinner in a marriage. They were married for 20 years. Retirement starts at $10,000 when they get into the retirement. 20 years later, parties decide to get divorced. There is $300,000 in this retirement plan. But that $290,000 that was accumulated during the marriage, doesn't matter that it was come from your job and it was contributed by your employer and it was your hard work and your sweat. 50% of that is owed to the other spouse. And unless you have a premarital agreement, there's nothing you can do about that. And so again, I know that we've been real positive on everything, but that's something people need to understand that.
Yeah, that is a concern.
That's one area that's actually pretty black and white. Like, there's not a whole lot you can do to prevent your spouse from taking half of that when and if you go through a divorce. So that's one of the things that I think people have a lot of misconceptions about premarital agreements. They think prenups are bad. They provide a lot of protection, like you were talking about. And in the unfortunate event of a divorce, they actually can simplify that process and maybe minimize some of the pain that you go through with a long divorce process.
Absolutely. So, moral of the story, we want prenup.
We want prenup. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, guys, thanks for listening today. Thanks for tuning in to talk about this lovely subject on the eve of Valentine's. If you got any more questions about it, DM us, let us know. Stay tuned for closing arguments. We've got a story about the U.S. Border Patrol.
Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to #Lawyer Today. But wait, before you go, we want to make sure that you know where to find us on all the socials. So catch up with us on the audiovisual portion on YouTube. We have a #Lawyer channel there that we're very excited for you to take a look at if you want to put some faces to names. I know I love doing that. Make sure to follow us on our Instagrams, whether it be the #Lawyered Instagram or Austin's and my personal Instagrams. We check all three, so make sure to DM us or frankly leave comments on all of our latest posts to make sure that we're covering the topics that you guys are interested in. And if you have any questions or you're like, hey, I heard this in the news today, I think it's really interesting, I kind of want you and Austin to break it down for me and give the legal perspective so that I am well equipped at my next dinner party or Zoom cocktail hour, COVID and all that, to be able to discuss this with my friends. So again, thank you so much for listening. Make sure to rate and review the podcast on whatever platform that you're listening to. And we are so thankful that you're listening, and tune back in next week. Bye, y'all.
Increased immigration enforcement has the U.S. strapped with a decision to release or deport Central American families currently being held at the border. So the U.S.-Mexican border near Tamaulipas is an area with a high rate of illegal immigration in the U.S. It's actually got the highest rate that we have. And it has, for that reason, the largest share of detainees of Central American families currently. With the COVID-19 restrictions and new Mexican policy, where the country will no longer accept Central American families with children under the age of 6 that are sent back to Central America, the U.S. Border Patrol now has a decision to make. Do we detain these families? Do we let them free until their immigration hearings? What do we do with this? It's going to be very interesting to see how a post-President Trump era of Border Patrol reacts to this situation.